What makes art powerful? What does that even mean? How do works of art speak to us, move us, enlighten us? Does art really do these things, or we have just been taught that they do? When we study art, we are taught to analyze artworks to try and understand how they communicate to us. We look at the form of the work, the artist's theme, and the context in which the work was created. We may study art history and take a studio art class. Maybe we even go to a professional art school. Presumably, in these art courses, we are taught how to develop the skills to effectively use visual language to express ideas. But what about artists who do not go to art school? Is it possible that without studying art in a formal way, that an artist can produce effective visual statements? Is it possible for artists with very few traditional art-making skills to make powerful art? In this video, we are going to explore art made by people who have not been professionally trained or do not participate in the mainstream art world. These artists are known as outsider artists. Before we look at some outsider artwork, let's frame our task with a question. Is it fair or useful to evaluate work made by outsider artists with the same criteria as we would judge work made by professionally trained artists? Is this a good painting? What about this one? How did you decide? There must be some criteria. Is it fair to compare these paintings according to skill? Bouguereau clearly is very skilled at making a representational painting. But does that mean that Picasso is not skillful? Here's a drawing from Picasso when he was only 15. So clearly the objectives of these two artists were different. Is how well they achieved those objectives the determining factor in deciding if the painting is successful or not? What about these two portraits? If the objective of the artist on the right was to make a likeness of Michael Jackson, then clearly he or she was successful. Then why is that artist anonymous while Matisse is considered one of the most important artists of the 20th century? I wonder what Madame Matisse might have thought. We're going to look at three categories of outsider artists. Artists who suffered from mental illness, artists who were incarcerated in prison, and artists who are driven by a particular personal vision. As we look at the artists here, be critical. Do these artists make artwork that moves us in some way, or are they simply unskilled in making bad art? Adolf Wolfli was born in Bern, Switzerland, and abused as a child. He was briefly in the army and spent some time in jail. In 1895, he was admitted to the Waldo Clinic and diagnosed with a psychosis which led to hallucinations. Drawing was the only thing that seemed to calm him down. A doctor at the clinic, Walter Morgenthaler, took an interest in Wolfli's drawings and wrote about Wolfli in his book, A Psychiatric Patient as an Artist. In 1908, Wolfli embarked on an epic and fantastical tale of his transformation from a child to Saint Odulf II. The work went to 45 volumes and contained over 25,000 pages and 1,600 illustrations. A Mexican immigrant to the United States in 1925, Martin Ramirez was institutionalized in 1931. In 1948, he was transferred to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, where he began to draw. He used any paper he could secure, paper bags, examining table paper, and book pages which he glued together with a paste of potato and saliva. His work included imagery from traditional Mexican folklore, the Catholic religion, and modern technology. The schizophrenia that afflicted German Johann Knopf sometime after 1906 caused him to suffer from delusions that he was being persecuted as a Christ-like martyr. His drawings are filled with frenetic lines, symbols, and text, often making reference to religious symbolism and liturgy. He also made works concerning his childhood. His art is seemingly about uniting the personal and the divine. He was featured in Dr. Hans Prinzhorn's 10 Schizophrenics as someone whose art deserved consideration beyond a diagnostic view. Another artist featured in the Prinzhorn collection, Joseph Heinrich Griebing, showed painstaking but indecipherable diagrams, maps, and charts in which the over-elaboration may be a visual metaphor for the psychotic yet meticulous mind of their maker. Miroslav Tichy was an exception to the outsider art classification, as he did actually attend the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague. He is considered an outside artist more for his technique and style, and for his use of homemade cameras and his eccentric lifestyle. Tichy lived on a small government pension and would wander the streets of his hometown Kiev taking pictures. These pictures were often of women taken surreptitiously and with long-distance telephoto lenses he constructed, and the photos have a peeping Tom quality to them. Each negative was only printed once by Tichy, and he did not make them for sale, but rather for his own pleasure. His work was unknown until 2004, when a childhood friend of his began to preserve Tichy's deteriorating photographs, and the collection was seen at the Biennial of Contemporary Art in Seville. Born in 1898, Eddie Arne was institutionalized as a young man for violent behavior. In 1964, after 60 years in the institution, he was introduced to crayons and began coloring. In the next 10 years, he made over 2,000 drawings. In 1973, Arne was expelled from the home for bad behavior and suddenly gave up drawing completely. People are sent to prison as both a punishment and to be rehabilitated. While that seems to rarely happen very successfully, prisoners, like everyone else, have a need to express themselves. What they rarely have are access to art materials. But the creative impulse is strong, and as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. Emerging in the 1930s, one form of prisoner art is known as paños. Originally drawn on bedsheets and pillowcases with ballpoint pen, paños drawings were originally used to communicate. Now paños are primarily an art form, drawn on handkerchiefs which prisoners receive from home. Originating with Chicano prisoners in the southwest U.S., paños tends to have religious, family, and the old neighborhood themes. Other prisoners cleverly use what is available to them. Toilet paper, packaging from the few goods they have access to, matchsticks, bars of soap, colored pencils mixed with baby oil or Vaseline can be used as pigment. During his 15-year sentence for drug-related crimes, Raymond Madison used to salvage worn socks and used the thread as the material for his miniature prison tapestries. Upon his release, he has become an exhibited artist and has won many awards. Whether institutionalized for health or criminal reasons, the nature of incarceration provides plenty of routine and time where a patient or prisoner with an interest in making art can stay focused. Outside of these environments, where there are more distractions and options, some self-taught artists' obsessions become a lifelong focus for their activities. Like Richard Dreyfuss's Mashed Potato Mountain and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the work of these artists must be built. Elisha Pierce began wood carving as a child. Raised on a farm in Mississippi, he eventually decided on a career as a barber. After his first wife died in 1915, he lived life as a hobo for a few years, until he eventually received his preacher's license. In 1920, he remarried and settled down in Columbus, Ohio. Working as both a preacher and barber, he began to carve more seriously. In 1932, Pierce completed his Book of Wood, which told the story of Jesus through carved bas-reliefs held together with wax paper. Baseball, animals, and politics were all subjects for Pierce's work as well. John Searle took up painting in the California desert town of Lake Elsinore after World War II. Initially motivated by the need to decorate his home, he painted mostly with oil paints on cardboard. He devoted himself to painting until he passed away at age 98 in 1993.
Emery Blagdon, the healing machine. Sometime in the 1940s, Emery Blagdon began making small bent wire objects he called his pretties. Other family members spent evenings crocheting or tatting and viewed Emery's work as a pastime akin to their own. Blagdon himself said little about these sculptural projects, but he began attaching his pretties to one another in increasingly complex conglomerations. Because Blagdon believed he was unusually sensitive to electrical currents, he was eager to explore the curative potential of electricity. By the late 1950s, Blagdon had built a workshop and an adjoining shed to house his creations. He began transforming the shed into a complex unit for conducting energy. He called it the healing machine.
Raised in Nebraska, Emery Blagdon left home as a young man to wander. He returned to his family's home when both his parents died of cancer. He began working on his healing machine. He invited his neighbors to take part in its healing powers. Ironically, Blagdon himself died of cancer in 1986. Minnie Jones was born in 1892 in North Carolina to a 13-year-old mother. As a child, she experienced intense dreams and waking visions. Minnie was taught by her grandmother that these were signs and wonders. Minnie herself married at age 16, and she and her husband lived on the estate of his employer, rich industrialist Pembroke Jones. The estate was eventually turned into Arley Gardens. Evans worked there her entire life. On Good Friday, 1935, she heard a voice that said, "Why don't you draw or die?" She made her first drawing that day. Inspired by the gardens, her work was also informed by African, Caribbean, and East Indian imagery. The visions of Madge Gill were of a different sort. After recovering from an illness in 1920, she began to make drawings, mostly done in ink on paper, but claimed that the real author of these drawings was a spirit named My Interest, who guided her. She was extremely prolific, often completing dozens of drawings in a single night, always signing them My Interest. She rarely showed her drawings and refused to sell them for fear of angering her spirit guide. Thousands of drawings were discovered in her home after her death in 1961. The drawings of Chris Hipkiss are a fusion of the ideas of married couple Chris Payne and Alpha Mason. Hipkiss is a pseudonym for their collective efforts. Although Chris is the actual draftsperson, he claims he cannot work without the input of Alpha. The drawings are a hybrid of civilization where nature and urban landscapes meet. Hipkiss's standing as an outsider artist is a bit controversial as he and Alpha have actively pursued artistic recognition. While Chris has no artistic training, Alpha does. The artists describe their work as a love story in the form of a visual diary. One of the best-known outsider artists is Henry Darger. Born in Chicago in 1892, Darger's mother died when he was 4 years old after giving birth to a sister who was then given up for adoption. Darger lived with his father until his father could no longer afford to care for him, and he was placed in the Illinois Asylum for the Feeble-Minded Children. Yes, that's what they actually called it. Darger eventually escaped from the home in 1908 and returned to Chicago, where he found employment as a custodian in a hospital, where he would remain employed until his retirement in 1963. Darger also lived in the same apartment for 43 years. It was here that he worked on his 15,140-page work, The Story of the Vivian Girls in what is known as the Realms of the Unreal, of the Glandeco-Anglican war storm caused by the Child Slave Rebellion, which describes an epic battle between 7 princesses of Abyania against the Glandelians. Darger also wrote and illustrated other works, like the 10,000-page Crazy House and the 5,000-page The History of My Life. At the end of his life, Darger became ill and moved to the St. Augustine's Catholic Mission home. His landlord, a photographer Nathan Lerner, discovered Darger's work after he was placed in the hospital. Lerner and his wife took charge of Darger's estate and helped to promote his work. Some outsider artists have expanded their visions to include whole environments. Legend has it that as a young man in Thailand, Unaliao Suliat fell into a cave and met the hermit Kiku, who became his spiritual mentor. After completing his spiritual apprenticeship in 1958, he began working on a monumental sculpture, Buddha Park, in Laos by the Mekong River. His personality and enthusiasm appealed to the locals, and along with many unskilled volunteers, his sculpture garden grew. This vision of a blend of Buddhism and Hinduism comes together in these large sculptures. In 1978, he began work on a sister park, Salakiku, on the Thai side of the Mekong River. Although never ordained, he was given the honorific Long Pu, usually reserved for monks by the locals. In 1947, India was redesigning the city of Chandigarh into a modern utopia. It was to be the first planned city in India. Nek Chand found work there as a public roads inspector. Chand began collecting materials from various demolition sites around town and took them to a protected forest and began to work on his visionary world, the Kingdom of Sukrani. Although using this land was technically illegal, Chand worked on his rock garden, which had grown to 12 acres, for 18 years before it was discovered by the authorities. They threatened to destroy the park, but Chand was able to get public opinion on his side, and in 1976 it was designated as a public park. It is now tended to by the Rock Garden Society. Commanded by God to spread the gospel, Baptist minister Howard Finster began the construction of Paradise Gardens on his land in Summerville, Georgia. It contains over 46,000 pieces of art. His garden contains the Bible House, the Hubcap Tower, and the 5-story folk art chapel. He was also a prolific painter and designed album covers for the bands Talking Heads and REM. Italian immigrant Sabato, or Simon Rodia, moved to Los Angeles in 1920, where he worked as a construction worker and tile mason. On his small patch of land in the neighborhood of Watts, he began working on his Nostro Pueblo, our town in Italian, which are commonly known as the Watts Towers today. From 1921 to 1954, Rodia built his towers from scraps of rebar, concrete, broken bottles, and tiles, which the neighborhood kids would bring him. The city of Los Angeles began to hassle Rodia about the construction, and in 1955 he sold his land to his neighbor and abandoned the project. Threatened with demolition, the Committee for Simon Rodia's Watts Towers was formed by concerned citizens, and the towers were saved. They are now a National Historic Landmark. A grave sweeper in Chartres, France, Raymond Isidore began decorating his small house with broken glass and crockery to escape the mundane aspects of his daily routine. Eventually, all the surface of his house, save for the bed sheets, were covered with the mosaic. Known as Les Maisons Picassettes, Isidore would scour the town for broken pots, ashtrays, and perfume bottles. Using only a trowel, soup spoon, fork, and pocket knife, and mixing mortar from limestone and sand which he colored with crushed blue chalk, he devoted 30 years, 29,000 hours, and 15 tons of crockery to his project. Many mainstream contemporary artists have been drawn to the freedom of expression of the outsider artists. One of the early champions of this type of art was French artist Jean Dubuffet. Looking for inspiration for his own work, Dubuffet began collecting the art of the insane, prisoners, and children, and was influenced by Hans Prinzhorn's book, Artistry of the Mentally Ill. Dubuffet was convinced that insanity holds the promise of creativity, and found that these outsider artists were not sullied by the concerns of professional artists, and therefore had a more pure approach to creativity. He founded the movement Art Brut, in which artists tried to bypass their formal training and achieve this pure form of expression. The pursuit of this pure expression has left its indelible mark on much of modern art in the 20th and 21st century. So we have seen a small sampling of the work done by people who were not making art for the art consumer. Whether for therapeutic purposes or the saving of souls, this art has been made with passion, obsession, and focus. But have we answered our original question? Does this art from outsiders have power? Or like a child's drawing, does it remain unsophisticated? Does it move us in some way, or is it only of anthropological interest? Does it give us insight into the human condition, or simply highlight failures of aspects of our society? Is it fair to judge this art by the same standards by which we would judge Da Vinci or Botticelli? Perhaps these questions will help us expand our definition of art and human expression.